Hi, I'm Dr. Beth Molleson.
And I'm Dr. Alyssa Watson.
And thank you all for joining us in the Veterinary Breakroom, where Dr. Alyssa and I have short conversations about various topics going on in vet medicine right now. So today we're going to talk, at least for us, Alyssa, we're old enough that we can consider this one kind of a throwback. We're gonna talk about the NAVLE. So for some of you out there, it may be fresher on your minds than others. But when Alyssa and I were talking about it, we were saying at one point in our life, this was kind of an all-consuming test, and it was really dictated a lot of our lives for a year or two there when we were preparing for it and studying for it. And so we wanted to kind of get into some details.
Yeah, another thing that brought it up was it's been a few weeks, a month or so now since the scores were posted. But this year, when scores were posted, I was seeing, at least anecdotally, several posts on Facebook and things like that about people not passing. And there were posts about, the origination of the test. Certainly, we're going to talk a little bit more towards the bottom of the episode about what to do if you happen to not pass this test, and how this test definitely does not define you as a practitioner. But one of the things that really surprised me was that this test, for some reason, when I took it, which was, I graduated in 2003, and when I took it, I had the assumption that the test had been around and been used for quite a long time, but that's actually not the case. And so I was a little surprised to learn that the test, the online version of the NAVLE, started to be used in, the year 2000. I think it was the 2000-2001 class that started using this particular test format, as their national exam. And so that was surprising to me, and it made me want to learn a little bit more about the history of the test. And so that was one of the other things that sparked this conversation.
Yeah, and I had the same impression as you, Alyssa. I assumed it had just been around for generations, maybe not in an online computer format, but figured it was just kind of had transitioned through the years to be what it was now. But yeah, there was that sharp distinction in the year 2000 where it started, and it used to just be paper and pencil tests. The national board exam and the clinical competency tests were kind of the older screening versions for licensure. So that was interesting. And it is a test that's created by the International Council for Veterinary Assessment. They don't just make the NAVLE. They do make some other tests as well that are used internationally or for various state requirements, things like that. A few other facts, they said about 6,000 to 7,000 people take it every year, which I thought was interesting. And then for those of you who it's been a while or have blocked it out, you may or may not remember, it's 360 questions, or if you haven't taken it yet, 360 multiple choice questions. 300 of them are the scored questions, and then they include 60 of what they call the pre-test questions, which are unscored and are kind of used, I'm assuming, to develop future test questions. But of course, they don't tell you which is which. There is, I'm sure we could dive in even more on the creation of this test. Obviously, the fact that there's a whole council that creates it kind of tells you a little bit about how much research goes into it, and there's committees that decide the test questions and decide what topics to focus on. They say there are stakeholders in academia, the licensing boards, and as well as practicing veterinarians that go into kind of collaborating for this, and it's used throughout the US and Canada. Again, may or may not remember that testing goes on for a 4-week period in the fall, and then again for a 2-week period in April. And my last fun fact is that it costs $740 to take, which that stings.
It's a bit, and certainly, obviously the money's non-refundable. You pay the money, you have to pay the money if you have to take the test again. Interesting, when we were doing some homework for this episode today, I looked at maybe taking a practice test, because it has been 20 years since I have taken this test, and even the practice test is $50. And so I didn't do that because I think I've mentioned on this show before that I'm cheap.
Podcast budget is $0 and we're cheap. Right. Yes.
So, but yeah, I mean, that's a lot of things. The questions certainly, you know, the multiple choice questions. This was another thing that I think I remembered inaccurately, either that or maybe it's changed over the years. But there is one answer to each of these questions. You know, it's the best answer. It's a multiple choice best answer. It's not going to be, you know, select all that apply.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was one thing that maybe I just remember it inaccurately.
It's morphed into something even worse in your
Yeah,
mind
it
since
has.
then.
It maybe has, because
Uh,
that was one thing that I feel like I remember preparing for, was like, oh, it could be answers A,
oh
B, and
God.
never D. But
Yeah, we can't rely on my memory. I have no recollection of that, Alyssa. So either you made it up or it's possible it changed. But and you know, I shouldn't laugh about this test being so far in the past, because along those lines where you've seen posts about the NAVLE recently on Facebook, I've actually seen a fair number of people bring up the fact that in some states, if you go to request licensure in a different state or apply for a license in a different state, they have various requirements and you may find yourself getting to take the NAVLE again. So, you know, of course, every state's different, but sometimes it's a matter of if you haven't been working full time for the last 5 years, if you've taken a certain amount of time off, that they will actually require you to retake this test. So I guess you never know where life takes you. Any one of us could maybe wind up getting to take this again.
yeah, and certainly it's something that I have heard people have um, kind of changed their career path or not
Mm-hmm.
considered relocating or things like that, because they do not want to take this test again. And it makes a lot of sense. The test questions are very broad. You
Mm-hmm.
know, I didn't take the full practice test for the $50, but they did offer, you know, 10 free practice questions that I ran through. And they are very diverse. I had a question about cattle. I had a question about a flock of birds. Just on the 10 practice questions, there was a question about goats and iguanas. So that's half of them right there that are
Mm-hmm.
not small animal exclusive. And so, you know, that's
Right.
something
It's
to
not a
consider
test you
too.
can
Yeah.
exactly just hop in and say, oh, I've been practicing. I should be fine and take this test. It requires a whole different approach as far as studying and preparation. So, do you remember your experience as a student? Like, did you do, I know I did vet prep. All I remember about it is this was like, I graduated in 2011. So, smartphones were just becoming a thing, but not quite universal. So I remember like these flashcards, just having a huge box of cards is really all I remember about my test preparation. I guess there was an online format as well that you could do on your laptop. But there was, you know, it was before the days of the app. I do remember doing that. I remember not necessarily completing the whole prep course, which left me with a lot of anxiety going into the test. Do you remember what your preparation looked like, Alyssa?
Yeah, we had a lot of study groups, you know, together. I don't remember that particular course, and I was definitely before smartphones and things. I actually didn't get a cell phone until senior year of vet school, because
Yes.
that was the way I could get away with not having a pager. But they were still handing out pagers when I was in vet school, you know, during your clinical
Yes.
rotation.
Could find
So
you anywhere with the pager.
yes, absolutely. So I do remember the test itself, because I had a delay in my test because there was a problem on the computer and there was a horrible snowstorm. It was in Iowa and there was
Oh
like a horrible
God.
blizzard. And I remember that.
That's funny. Yeah, I remember the test I do. Me and my best friend scheduled to take it at the same time. I remember it was November 18th. These things, so I guess some of these things I've committed to memory. And I just remember going to lunch afterward and us being like, "Oh my God, like that didn't go well." Which I don't know if everyone feels that way. Do you remember feeling that way?
Oh
I
yeah,
just
yeah.
I don't know.
There
There's
was a
always
lot of
that.
anxiety between then
Mhm.
and you know, the date when you find out your score and if you passed. So
Yes, exactly. Anxiety is a hallmark feature, I feel like, of this entire test. And the other thing we looked into as we you know, wanted to gather more information is, of course, standardized tests in general are a hot button issue at every level of education. And so, you know, it gets us wondering, does this test correlate to future performance? Do those
Mm-hmm.
that pass make better vets? Do those that fail the first time inherently show, reduced ability as a vet? I think a lot of us would answer that question as probably not. And of course, there's not any great studies out there that can correlate test scores to performance as a vet, because that's a hard thing to judge and grade. But there were some studies done about the NAVLE and how it correlates to maybe your GPA or even your GRE scores. So there was a study done using Kansas State students in 2014 that did find that their annual GPA and final class rank had a strong correlation with their NAVLE scores. But then it went on to say that there was a low correlation between the NAVLE and the GRE and the GPA of their pre-professional science courses. And then in 2020, there was another study done or published that said your undergraduate GPA and GRE were positively correlated with your vet school GPA and NAVLE scores. So a lot of this was a little bit hard to make sense of and find correlations between. But to me, the theme seemed to be, if you were a good test taker, you were a good test taker. To me, it didn't necessarily prove like smarter people are really doing better on the NAVLE. It seemed to be that consistent theme of, if you're nailing these tests in one area, you're more likely to perform well in the NAVLE.
Yeah. And there are absolutely strategies to taking standardized multiple choice tests, and that is out there. All that information is out there. That's one of the things that a lot of these courses help you to do, not even so much, memorizing material and content, but what is a good strategy when you're taking these multiple choice tests in order to narrow down the correct answer. So,
yeah. Absolutely. And, I feel like that kind of brings us to talking about, as like you said, there are strategies. It's not just a matter of knowledge. It's a matter of nailing the strategies. It's a matter of being able to manage test anxiety, which is a real thing. There are studies that show people that then have medically managed anxiety can perform that much better on tests. So, there are many factors that go into it more than just your knowledge base. And of course, that brings us to, what if you fail? And the pass rates, it looks like over the last 4 years, which, Alyssa, I know we talked about this, and our hypothesis was that maybe because of COVID, we were seeing test rates drop. It looks like over the last 4 years, the results have been fairly consistent, or 90 to 95% pass rate. So I thought that was interesting.
It was interesting, but at the same time, like, I saw that in the, there was a website, dedicated to talking about the NAVLE, the performance, how the questions, how the committee comes up with the questions, so that it's all very transparent. And that was said right on that website, that the pass rate has stayed very consistent over the past 4 years. Except I didn't feel like dropping to 90% from 95% was consistent, but we only had those 4 years. So,
exactly.
Maybe a range of plus or minus 5% is normal if you look back over the 22 years of the test. But for me, it was like back in 2018, 2019, it was 95%. And then 1920, it was 94%. And then a big jump, 2021 down to 92%, and 21-22 down to 90%. And so I felt reading that was a drop, but possibly we just don't have the information, from the previous years in order to compare it to.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think it did, fluctuate, went up and then maybe down a little bit. And that was my assumption too, is that those are the, they're used to seeing that amount of variation in the test scores. They didn't give us that data to show us that, but they kind of made that assumption. The other thing that I think would be interesting for anyone, taking the NAVLE or things like that, is to look at school-specific test scores. I couldn't find any great data readily available, but I believe you can find scores, if a certain vet school has their numbers dropping over the last decade. I find that information kind of interesting. And I have to think that, maybe these academic institutions are using that as a way to hopefully guide curriculum and kind of give them some insight into their curriculum and make changes with those statistics. So I could see that being kind of a helpful resource for universities to make changes. But one of the things we wanted to highlight in this podcast is that plenty of people do fail, even though the pass rate is relatively high. It is not an uncommon thing. Does not need to be the end of the world. You can retake, it varies by state, but you can retake in most states the NAVLE up to 5 times. So there's, another chance that can be taken. And we noticed on Facebook too that there have been some Facebook groups out there to offer support or offer testing strategies, which I thought was an amazing resource, because I feel like there's nothing worse than kind of that moment of isolation if you find out you failed and feel like you're the only one. So I would encourage anyone in that situation to maybe, seek out those resources and get tips for maybe passing the next time as well.
Sure. Yeah, definitely saw that. And I saw just a outpouring of support, from veterinarians in practice now about their experiences where, they didn't pass the first time or the second time or sometimes even the third time. And they're very successful and very happy with what they do. And so, yeah, I think making sure that we end on that note that, like I said, towards the beginning of the episode, this is one test. And it does not define you, and it does not define, the veterinarian that you are or are going to become. And so.
Absolutely. I think it would be fun to make a cohort of practicing, practicing small animal veterinarians take the test with zero preparation and see their scores. And that might make the students feel a little bit better when the majority of us remember very little information that is actually on that test. So
yep, definitely missed the iguana question. So.
There would be a lot of species where it would just be empty answers for me. But anyway, Alyssa, hopefully we'll keep our fingers crossed for both of us that we don't have to relive that test anytime soon. And I think that brings us to our win of the week. So do you have any wins to share with us from the last week?
Yeah, actually, you know what? I do have a win. So I had recently, my stepdaughter's cat got very ill, stopped eating, developed hepatic lipidosis. And so I need to give a shout out to Dr. Stacy Nato, one of my colleagues, a good friend. I took the cat in and she was kind enough to pop a feeding tube in for me because I didn't have any clinic shifts scheduled anytime soon. And we were able to get her through that crisis, and her feeding tube came out just the other day. So, and she's doing great and eating on her own. So that is definitely my win.
That's a huge win. Yes, that's great news. I know you had mentioned that, but I hadn't heard how she was doing. So that's good to hear. And Alyssa, my win this week is very big.
Yes.
And that is...
I've been waiting.
There is a new family member in my house, 4-legged only. And yeah, I finally got a second dog. If anybody has listened, I have been on the hunt for a second dog for, 6 months maybe. And just given the fact that I have 2 small children and a dachshund who's a little bit picky, it has been quite the hunt to find the perfect fit. And so I found a 4-year-old retired breeder miniature poodle who was looking for a home. His breeders have retired as well. And so they had agreed that they were going to keep 2 dogs and wound up keeping 2 dogs of a different breed. Anyway, he grew up with kids. So I knew that was going to be a go. They said he was good with other dogs. So my best friend and I drove longer than I would like to admit across the country to go get him, and then road tripped back. And he's been with us for about 10 days maybe. And he's doing pretty well. Good. We've had our ups and downs, and Paul the dachshund has mixed feelings.
How's Paul doing?
Yeah, he's hanging in there. No, they do pretty well. They're both kind of the type of dog that just ignores the other type of dog, but they are both very clingy. So Daniel's the new dog's name. He is after Elton John song. He is very attached to me already and has some separation anxiety. So it's more a matter of like he and Paul fight for my attention. So that has really been the biggest hiccup. And Daniel is not yet neutered. So there is a thin layer of urine covering all surfaces in my house due to his marking. So he is scheduled to get neutered. But
overall, that brings me to my question. Are you going to do it, or are you going to have someone else neuter him?
Yes, I laugh because that's a topic we've talked about before.
Yep.
I'm going to have my lovely colleague, Dr. Thompson, neuter him. And I actually probably would have if I was on a surgery shift in the next few weeks, but
Yep.
kind of similar to your situation. I asked her if she would do it, and she kindly said yes. So
thank goodness for wonderful colleagues,
Thank
that can
goodness,
step in and
indeed.
do some of this when we're not scheduled to be in clinic.
Yep, exactly. So yeah, overall, he has been a win. So he counts for the win of the week. Hopefully he and Paul continue to adjust. But yeah, overall, he's been a good addition. He's laying behind me right now as we speak. So anyway, well, thank you to our audience for joining us today. And we will talk with everyone next episode.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Veterinary Breakroom. If you enjoyed today's episode, you can find us wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, including a video version on YouTube. While you're there, make sure you subscribe, rate, and review. You can also listen to or watch our podcast episodes on our website at cliniciansbrief.com/podcasts, or drop us a line at podcasts@briefmedia.com. Veterinary Breakroom is a Brief Media production, produced by Alexis Ussery and co-hosted by Dr. Alyssa Watson and Dr. Beth Molleson.